Well, let me explain what we're going to talk about today. If you'll look at the table of contents with me, and you should have a packet of about 28 pages long, you'll see here that we're going to do a little bit of an overlap. And what I mean by overlap is last week I did a webinar called about applications and inquiries, and I explained what an application was. And really, that material was about 2 hours in length, and this material is about 2 hours in length, although they very much go hand in hand. We need to understand what an application is before we can understand about joint intent, because to do joint intent, you have to do it at the time of application. So I'm going to repeat a little bit of that today just to set the table for getting into the Roman numeral 2, really the meat of this, of requiring signatures, who you can make sign, etc. And then we're going to talk about evidencing that, Roman numeral 3, of when you have more than one applicant and you're having more than one person sign, who or how you do that. And then if you look through Roman numeral 4, 5 through 8 down there, there's basically some supplementary materials that I'm going to give to you that helps fill in the gaps, because this is an area that really there isn't a lot of regulatory guidance on. And so we've got to use some common sense maybe. We've got to use some practical applications and say, well, if that's what they mean, how do we do this? And so that's what we're going to cover today. And really what we won't be covering is all the other regulations that come out of applications. But there is something I want to point out to you at the very bottom there, and that is the bullet that says when you see things in italices, I want you to understand that I'm quoting from the regulations. Now, if you'll go to page 1 with me, you'll see a lot of italices there in the very beginning. Later on, it won't be quite as much. So at the end of every section where we have the italices, so we're quoting from the regs, you'll see where it comes from. And that is just something I'm very big on as an instructor. I don't want you to believe me. I want you to be able to look it up yourself. I want you to challenge me. I want you to question it. I want you to know that this is what that reg says, not because Dave Dickinson said so, but because that's what you understand the reg or the commentary or the memo or whatever that we're referencing, and so where that came from. So I'm trying to teach you how to fish rather than hand you a fish, if you will. All right, well, let's get started into today's program. And page 1 then, what is an application? And again, there's a little bit of overlap if you were with us last week. It's, first off, an oral or written request. And that's important to understand that it can be oral. When we get to joint intent, I might be on the phone with somebody. An application is not a piece of paper. Now, we all have forms that we call applications. If I was in front of you and I held up this piece of paper and it was a Fannie Mae 1003 or it was a consumer app or a commercial app or whatever, but it has the word application on it, I would hold this up in front of you and I would say these are not applications. They document applications. So back to letter A, an application can be verbal or in writing, but it's a request for an extension of credit. And really that's the key. It's a request for an extension of credit. Now it goes on to say made in accordance with procedures, not policy, procedures established by your bank for the type of credit requested. And to kind of fill that in, maybe we're talking about a $1,000 overdraft line. Well, your procedures on that might be to look at their DDA activity to see if they've had overdrafts, that kind of thing. We're talking about $1 million commercial line. You might be looking at a lot more things, and that's what they mean by procedures established. But if you look at letter B, the commentary to that same section also says it's your actual practices as well as your stated application procedures. Let me substitute some words. What are you doing in the real world? Don't tell me what your policy says. So somebody calls and I'm jotting notes on a notepad. That's my application procedures. Now, we really could draw a line there because I'm trying to push towards joint intent today. Joint intent documentation applies to applications, not to completed applications. You don't have to have a completed application before you trigger joint intent. You trigger joint intent when you have what I'm going to call an initial application. So the definition of completed app really isn't that important to me for this topic. And we're not going to really go into all the detailed differences between an application and a completed application. That was really the previous webinar that I spoke about. And I just realized, and I have to apologize for this, if you go to page 2, there's a note there about this requirement that it talks about in completed applications back on page 1, basically saying it's your requirement to get that information from the applicant, and we covered that in the previous webinar. So let's get to page 3. That's what I want to do, and really this is what the meat, well, joint intent is the meat of the program, but we're going to set the table here because this is where it comes from. Look at Roman numeral 2. Equal credit opportunity, Reg B is what we're talking about, is the anti-discrimination, illegal discrimination at least. Thou cannot consider race, sex, age, marital status, national origin, etc. But it also gets into who can you make sign. And again, this is a little bit of an overlap if you were here with the previous webinar, but this is very important to understanding the joint intent requirements. So let's slow down a little bit. Letter A, you cannot require the signature of a spouse or other person. Now, they specifically mention spouses, and I'm going to get off on a little bit of a tangent here. Fair lending is really what Reg B is about. My personal opinion, I've been saying this for 5-6 years, is that fair lending is the volcano about to erupt, and maybe for some of you, it has erupted. Fair lending is a big, big deal, and it seems like that examiners are going after this and asserting claims and poking a lot of fingers into some areas that maybe in the past, or maybe you haven't had a recent exam, they haven't made such a big deal. Fasten your seatbelt. Fair lending is something they are all over right now. And it's not just spouses, but that seems to be the main area. So this part of the reg is saying you can't make a spouse sign or other person. Okay, now, so really if I was to write this reg, I would say you just can't require the signature of anybody other than joint applicants. The people that apply I can make sign, but nobody else. Okay? And then we'll go on and we'll break this down. It says on any credit instrument, I'll come back to that, and then if they qualify under your standards of creditworthiness for the amount in terms of credit requested. Well, let's dissect that a little bit. Letter B, when they say backing up an A on any credit instrument, what they mean is liability documents, not security documents. I can make somebody sign security documents so that I can perfect. I cannot make somebody become liable. So to go back up to letter A, I can't require the signature of a spouse or any other person on any liability instrument, notes, guarantees, those types of things. I can make someone sign security agreements, mortgages, deed of trust, etc., so that we can perfect. Okay? So I'm going to break this down a little bit and kind of walk you through. If I was a loan officer and you walked into my office or called me, one of the questions that is fair game is who's all applying. I'd recommend you write that down. You can ask, who's all applying? It might be that one person is in front of you representing another party. So I walk in and say, my wife and I, okay, that question's already, answered. I can then, I can still ask the question, is there anybody else applying? But I need to know who all is on this note, on the guarantee, who's all going to be liable. Number 2, what collateral are you providing? And that leads to question number 3, who all owns that collateral? Those are all fair game questions, if you will. Who's applying? What collateral are you providing? Who owns that collateral? I need to know who owns it because I can make those people sign security instruments. And that doesn't violate letter A above. Now, I want you to also notice in letter A at the end of that italices, we're talking about section 1002, that's Reg B, subsection 7D. That's the section that joint intent comes out of. But you won't find it in the reg. You'll only find it in the commentary. We're going to get there in a little bit. So make note that 7D is what we're looking at here. Okay? So, again, to repeat, I can't make anybody sign except those people that are applying on any liability documents. And then it says if the applicant qualifies under your standards of creditworthiness. We'll drop down to letter C. There's a lot of loan officers that say, well, Dave doesn't qualify on his own, so I can make his spouse sign. Let's look at letter C. If under your standards of creditworthiness, liability of additional party is necessary to support the request,